"You're nothing but a burden," my daughter-in-law shouted as I struggled down the stairs at 3 a.m. 6 weeks after hip surgery, desperate for my pain medication. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend me. Instead, he said, "Dad apologized to my wife." I left without another word. Hours later, my debit card was declined at a pharmacy. When I checked my account, my hands went cold. My entire $85,000 life savings had vanished. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It genuinely means something to me. Drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country. I'd love to know who's in this room with me. A small note. This story contains fictional elements shaped for storytelling and reflection. Names and places are coincidental. But what this story carries, I believe it's worth your time. The clock on the nightstand read 3:14 in the morning when the pain woke me again. It wasn't a sharp pain, not the kind that makes you gasp and grab the sheets. It was the slow, grinding kind that builds from somewhere deep inside the hip joint, the kind that no position can quiet, the kind that reminds you hour after hour that your body has been opened up and put back together, and it hasn't forgiven you for it yet. 3 weeks out of surgery, and I still couldn't make it through a full night. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling of the guest room Derek had set up for me. Small room, single window. The kind of space you give someone when you're not sure how long they're staying. The pain medications were downstairs in the kitchen. I'd left them on the counter next to the coffee maker, so I wouldn't forget them in the morning. That had been the plan. A sensible plan. A plan that made a lot less sense at 3 in the morning when every step down a staircase felt like someone was tightening a bolt inside my hip with a wrench. I didn't call for Derek. I don't know if that was pride or habit, probably both. 40 years of getting up and handling things yourself tends to wire you a certain way. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, both hands gripping the mattress edge. Then I found the wall with my right hand and started toward the door. The hallway was dark. The staircase was at the far end, 14 steps wooden, the kind that creak under any weight at all. I'd counted them the first night I arrived. Old habit. Engineers count things. I took them one at a time. Right hand on the banister, left hand flat against the wall, weight shifting slow and deliberate onto my good leg before trusting the other. Each step pulled at the incision site. Not terrible, manageable. The kind of pain you breathe through, not the kind you stop for. I was on the 7th step when the light came on. Not the soft glow of a nightlight, the full hallway light flooding down from the top of the stairs. I looked up. Rachel was standing at the landing, one hand still on the switch. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired in the way that goes past one bad night, the tired of someone who hasn't been sleeping well for a long time. She looked at me on the stairs, one hand on the banister, moving at the pace of a man with a bolt in his hip, and something crossed her face. Not concern, something closer to irritation. "You're doing it again," she said. Her voice was low, but not quiet the way someone is quiet when they're trying not to wake a house. It was low the way a person is when they've been holding something in and they're done holding. I kept moving. Step 8. Step 9. Every night. Rachel continued, and her voice climbed a little. Every single night, Walter. The creaking, the shuffling, I can hear you through the walls. Do you know what it's like trying to sleep with that going on? Do you even think about that? I reached the bottom of the staircase. My palm was sweating against the banister. "I needed my medication, Rachel. It's in the kitchen." "Then why didn't you just keep it upstairs?" She came down 2 steps, arms crossing over her chest. "This is the 4th time this week. I have to be up at 6. Derek has a meeting. We can't keep doing this. I'm sorry the floor creaks, I said. And I meant it, I did. A creaking floor is a creaking floor. It's not just the floor. Her voice went tighter. It's everything, Walter. You're everywhere. You're in the kitchen when I'm trying to make breakfast. You're in the living room when I need quiet. You have no idea how exhausting it is, how exhausting you are. The word landed different than she probably meant it to. Exhausting. I stood at the bottom of the stairs in the dark kitchen doorway, 72 years old, 3 weeks out of a surgery I didn't entirely want, and listened to my daughter-in-law tell me I was exhausting. The bedroom door at the end of the hall opened. Derek stepped out. He was in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, squinting against the light. He looked from Rachel to me, then back to Rachel, reading the situation, the way a man reads a situation when he's trying to figure out how much trouble he's in. "What's going on?" he asked. "Your father," Rachel said. Just that. Your father. Derek looked at me standing there at the bottom of the stairs, hands still on the rail. I waited. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. Maybe for him to ask if I was all right. Maybe just for him to come stand on my side of the room. Some small thing. "Dad," Derek said, and he rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to do when he was a teenager and about to say something he knew I wasn't going to like. "You've got to be more careful. Rachel needs her sleep. We both do." "I needed my pain medication," I said. I know. He came down the hall a few steps, voice lowering like he was managing a situation, rather than talking to his father. "But maybe keep it in your room from now on, so you're not, you know." He gestured at the staircase, at me on it. "So you're not doing this in the middle of the night." "Derek." I looked at my son. "Are you asking me to apologize?" He didn't answer right away. The pause lasted exactly long enough to be its own kind of answer. "It would go a long way," he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Rachel, who had her arms still crossed, jaw set, waiting. Then I looked back at my son. "I'm sorry," I said. "I meant it as an apology, just not to Rachel." I got my medication from the kitchen counter. I filled a glass of water at the sink. I went back up the stairs, one step at a time, and I did not look back when the hallway light clicked off behind me. In the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed with the pill in my palm and the glass of water in my other hand. I didn't take it right away. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house settle the tick of the heat, turning on the muffled sound of Derek and Rachel talking through the wall too low to make out words. 42 years. I had been Derek's father for 42 years. I had driven him to baseball practice and helped him with geometry homework, and stood in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours when Owen was born. I had done things for that boy that I had never told anyone about, things that cost me more than money. And tonight he had stood in his hallway and asked me to apologize to his wife for having a bad hip. I put the pill on my tongue and swallowed it with half the glass of water. Then I reached into the nightstand drawer and took out a small notebook I'd brought with me from home. I opened to the first blank page. I didn't write anything yet. I just held the pen. Outside the window, the September night sat heavy over the suburb. A dog barked somewhere 2 streets over and then went quiet. The clock moved to 3:31. I thought about Eleanor. About what she would have said if she'd been here to see this. She had always seen Derek more clearly than I had, not harsher, just clearer. "You love him too much to look straight at him, Walt," she used to say. She wasn't wrong. I closed the notebook. I set the pen on top of it. There are decisions that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with clarity or drama or a voice telling you what to do. They arrive quietly in the middle of the night, at the bottom of a staircase, and by the time you sit back down on the edge of a bed with a glass of water in your hand, they're already made. I had made mine. I was already dressed by the time the first gray light came through the curtains. Not the clothes I'd been sleeping in proper clothes. The dark blue button-down Eleanor had given me 3 Christmases ago, the one I still ironed, even though she wasn't around to notice anymore. Khaki slacks. My good shoes, the brown leather ones I saved for occasions that mattered. I had learned a long time ago that how you dress for something tells you something about how seriously you're taking it. I took my suitcase from the closet, the same small one I'd brought when I arrived 6 weeks ago, and opened it on the bed. I didn't have much. A man my age who has lived alone for 4 years learns to pack light. I folded everything the way Eleanor had taught me, corners neat, nothing wasted. It took less than 20 minutes. Then I sat down at the little desk in the corner and took a piece of paper from the notepad Derek kept there for grocery lists and phone numbers. I held the pen over it for a moment. I had a lot of things I could have written. 42 years worth of things. In the end, I wrote one sentence: I don't want to be a burden. I left the note on the desk where it would be found. Then I carried the suitcase to the door of the guest room and went downstairs. Derek was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter in yesterday's clothes. Apparently he hadn't gone back to sleep either, and he had a mug of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, thumbing through something on the screen. He looked up when I came around the corner, and his eyes went straight to the suitcase. "Dad." He set the mug down. "What is that?" "A suitcase," I said. "I can see that." He came around the counter frowning. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving Derek." His face did something complicated, a quick sequence of expressions that moved through surprise and landed somewhere I could only describe as inconvenient. Not grief, not even real worry. The look of a man whose plan has just been disrupted. "You can't just leave," he said. "You're still recovering. You just had surgery 6 weeks ago, Dad. You can't." "I can walk," I said. "I can carry a bag. I can get into a car." "That's not the point." He stepped closer, lowering his voice like he did whenever he wanted to sound reasonable. "Where are you even going to go? You don't have anyone in Pittsburgh. You haven't been back there since the funeral." "I know where I'm going. Dad." He reached out and put his hand on the handle of the suitcase, not grabbing it, just resting there. "Last night Rachel was tired. She didn't mean it the way it came out. She gets like that when she hasn't slept." I looked at his hand on the handle of my suitcase. "Move your hand, Derek." Something shifted in his expression. Something that looked just for a second like the boy I used to know, the 12-year-old, who would get caught doing something wrong and immediately try to talk his way around it, eyes going uncertain at the edges. Then it was gone. He moved his hand. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was dressed for the day already, coffee in hand, and when she saw the suitcase, she had the grace to look at least slightly uncomfortable. "Walter, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," I said. "Not unkind, just honest. I think you both know that." She pressed her lips together and looked at Derek. Derek looked at the floor. Neither of them said anything else. I took out my phone and pulled up a cab app, the one Owen had put on my phone 2 months ago, when he'd visited for the summer. "Grandpa, you need Uber," he'd said, with the patient exasperation that 14-year-olds reserve for grandparents who are otherwise intelligent human beings. I'd used it twice before. I used it now. 4 minutes away. I stood by the front door with my suitcase and waited. Derek poured himself more coffee and leaned against the counter, watching me the way you watch something you're not sure what to do about. Rachel went upstairs. Then there were footsteps on the stairs, lighter, faster. Owen appeared at the bottom of the staircase in his school clothes backpack slung over one shoulder, hair still damp. He stopped when he saw me. "Grandpa." His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable, not emotion, just 14. "Are you going somewhere?" "I am," I said. "Where?" "Pittsburgh for now." He stared at me, then at the suitcase, then at his father across the kitchen. Derek had turned slightly away, looking into his coffee mug. Owen looked back at me. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Kids that age ask that question and mean something different than adults do. They mean, "Tell me the truth." They mean, "I already know it isn't, but I want to hear you say it." "Not entirely," I said, "but it will be." Owen nodded. He was a good kid, better than he knew. He shifted his backpack on his shoulder and said, "I'll walk to the bus stop." "Good," I said. "Work hard today. Hard." He started toward this front door, then stopped beside me. He didn't hug me. Owen wasn't much of a hugger, hadn't been since he was small. But he stood there for a second, close enough that I could have put my hand on his shoulder if I'd wanted to. "Come back okay," he said. Low, like it was just for me. My chest pulled tight in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. "I'll do my best," I told him. He went out the door. I watched through the narrow window beside the frame as he walked down the driveway, crossed the street, kept going without looking back. The kind of walk that means a person is holding themselves together by focusing on what's ahead. He got that from his grandmother. The cab arrived 3 minutes later. I carried my bag to the curb myself. Derek had come to the doorway by then, standing with one hand on the doorframe watching. He didn't offer to help with the bag. I didn't ask him to. The driver, a young man, maybe mid-20s, earbuds in one ear, popped the trunk, and I set the suitcase in. "Pittsburgh?" the driver asked, checking his phone. "Pittsburgh," I confirmed. I got in the back seat. Through the window I could see Derek still standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, growing smaller as the car pulled away from the curb. He didn't wave. I didn't either. What I did was look at my hands in my lap. These hands had drafted construction blueprints for 38 years, had poured concrete, read soil surveys, negotiated contracts, shaken hands on deals that built things meant to last 100 years, had held Eleanor's hand in the hospital at the end, had held Derek's hand when he was learning to cross the street. A father doesn't stop being a father just because his son stops acting like a son. That's not how it works. The love doesn't go anywhere. It just gets quieter. And sometimes quiet is exactly what it needs to be. The driver merged onto the highway heading east, and the Columbus skyline fell away behind us. I looked out at the road ahead, 4 hours to Pittsburgh, an empty motel room, no plan beyond this morning. That was all right. I had started with less before. Pittsburgh greeted me the way it always did. Gray skies sitting low over the river, the smell of rain somewhere an hour away, the kind of city that doesn't try to impress you, but holds up anyway. I checked into a motel off Forbes Avenue just past 5 o'clock, a small place clean enough, the kind where the bedspread is patterned to hide the wear and the heater makes a clicking sound when it first comes on. The woman at the front desk didn't ask me anything beyond my name and a credit card. That suited me fine. I put my suitcase on the luggage rack, sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, and felt the full weight of the day settle into my bones. 6 weeks since the surgery. 4 hours in a car. One morning that had changed everything. I needed my medication. I'd taken the morning dose before leaving Columbus, but I'd missed the afternoon one in the blur of packing and driving, and not letting myself think too hard about what I was doing. The clerk at the front desk told me there was a pharmacy 3 blocks east on Murray Avenue. I walked it slowly, favoring my right side the way I had for weeks, the October air cool enough to feel good after the stuffiness of the car. The pharmacy was the old-fashioned kind, narrow aisles, a real pharmacist behind a high counter, the smell of antiseptic and talcum powder. I found what I needed, brought it to the register, and slid my debit card through the reader. The machine beeped once, then the screen flashed, declined. "Let me try it again," The young woman at the register said patient and professional. She ran it again. Same result. She turned the screen gently toward me. Still not going through, sir. Would you like to try another card? My hands were steady, I'll give myself that. I took the card back and stepped away from the register, pulling out my phone. Just one moment, I said. I opened my banking app. It took a few seconds to load, and in those seconds, I had the odd floating feeling of a man standing on a diving board who hasn't looked down yet. Then the numbers loaded. Current balance $23.14. I read it 3 times. My eyes went to the transaction history, and my stomach dropped straight through the pharmacy floor. A series of transfers, 8 of them spread across 6 weeks each between $8,000 and $15,000. All initiated during the window I had been in the hospital, and then flat on my back in the guest room at Derek's house, too medicated to check my own phone clearly. The most recent one had gone through 4 days ago. $85,000. Gone. My throat went tight and dry. My hands, steady a moment ago, started to tremble just slightly, just enough that I had to grip the phone with both palms to keep the screen readable. I had saved that money across 15 years, deposit by deposit every quarter. Emergency money. Owen's college money. The kind of money that was supposed to mean that no matter what happened, I would never be a burden to anyone. Sir? The cashier's voice reached me from far away. Are you all right? I opened my mouth to answer, and heard instead a voice from behind me. Walter Hayes. It wasn't a question. I turned around. The woman standing there was in her late 60s, with silver hair cut short and practical, and eyes that were sharp in the way that years of night shifts and hard cases make eyes sharp. She was holding a small basket with a prescription bag in it, and she was looking at me with an expression I could only describe as recognition mixed with careful concern. Margaret Collins, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Margaret Collins had been a nurse at Allegheny General. Specifically, she had been the nurse on Eleanor's floor during the last 11 days of my wife's life. She had held Eleanor's hand during the worst of it. She had brought me coffee at 2 a.m. without being asked, and told me gently but honestly what the next few days would look like. There are people you never forget, not because of what they did, but because of when they did it. I retired 2 years ago, she said, already moving toward me, reading the situation the way nurses always do, taking in everything at once. I live near my daughter now, just off Squirrel Hill. She looked at my phone, still gripped in both hands, then at my face. What happened? My account, I said. Someone... I stopped. Took a breath. My son had access to my accounts while I was in the hospital. He was supposed to... Another stop. The words felt strange in my mouth because saying them out loud made them real in a way the numbers on a screen hadn't quite managed yet. $85,000, I finally said. It's gone. Margaret's face didn't collapse into horror or flood with sympathy. She just went very still, very focused, in the way of someone who has heard terrible things before and knows that falling apart alongside you doesn't help. She reached over and took the prescription bag out of my hands. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it, turned to the cashier and paid for it herself. Hey, I started. Eleanor would have done the same for me, she said. Don't argue with me, Walter. You look like you need to sit down. My eyes burned. Just for a second, just a flash of heat behind them, that I blinked back hard. I hadn't cried since Eleanor died. I wasn't planning to start in a pharmacy in Pittsburgh. I'm fine, I said, which was one of the more significant lies I'd told recently. Margaret handed me the bag and put a hand briefly on my arm. There's a coffee place 2 doors down, she said. Come sit with me. I'm not going to pretend I just ran into you and leave it at that. I looked at this woman who had held my wife's hand and paid for my medication without hesitating, and I thought about the 4-hour drive and the empty motel room and the $23.14 and the trembling in my hands that hadn't entirely stopped. All right, I said, let's get some coffee. The coffee shop was the kind of place that Pittsburgh does well. Worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, the hiss of an espresso machine cutting through low conversation. Margaret ordered 2 coffees without asking me what I wanted, which I didn't mind. She set one in front of me and sat down across the table like someone who had done this, delivered difficult comfort in small spaces 100 times before. Tell me from the beginning, she said. So I did. I told her about the surgery, about moving into Derek's house, about the weeks of feeling like a guest who had outstayed his welcome without anyone quite saying it. I told her about the stairs, about Rachel, about Derek standing in the hallway asking me to apologize, about the note I'd left on the desk that morning and the suitcase I'd carried to the curb. Margaret listened with her hand wrapped around her mug and her eyes on my face and didn't say a word until I'd finished. Then she said, "How long has Derek been managing your finances?" "He's not," I said. "He wasn't supposed to be. When I was admitted for surgery, the hospital had me sign a durable power of attorney, a legal document that lets someone make financial and medical decisions on your behalf while you're incapacitated. I named Derek because he was the only family nearby." I paused. I trusted him. Margaret nodded slowly. "And the power of attorney, did you revoke it after you recovered?" My chest tightened. I didn't think to. I assumed. I stopped. Engineers don't assume. It was the first rule I'd broken in 40 years, and I'd broken it for my son. "No, I didn't revoke it." "Then he still had legal access to your accounts." She wasn't accusing, just stating it quietly so I could hear it clearly. "Walter, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without shutting down. I'm 72, Margaret, not fragile. Say what you need to say." She wrapped her hands tighter around her mug. "About a year ago, I had a friend named Harold. 75, widower, sharp as a tack his whole life. After a small stroke, his son stepped in to quote-unquote help manage things. Harold thought it was kindness." Her voice tightened slightly. 6 months later, Harold found his savings account empty. His son had moved to Florida with a woman half his age and stopped returning calls. I stared at her. "How much?" "60,000, she said. Harold was too ashamed to report it at first. Thought people would say he should have been more careful." She looked me straight in the eye. "Does the name of Harold's son ring any bells? His last name was Garner. First name Mitchell." I turned the name over in my mind. Then something clicked cold and precise the way a gear engages. "Derek mentioned a Mitchell Garner," I said slowly. "Maybe 8-9 months ago. Said he was helping an older gentleman, a client, restructure some accounts. He made it sound like charity work." Margaret's expression told me everything before she said another word. "He knew Mitchell Garner," she said. "They weren't strangers, Walter." The coffee in my hands had gone lukewarm. I set the mug down carefully because my grip had gone unreliable again, fingers not quite cooperating, that low tremor I hated coming back. "He was learning," I said, "from Garner, or with him." "That's what I believe, yes." My jaw tightened until it ached. 42 years. Derek had sat across from me at 100 Sunday dinners and laughed at my terrible jokes and called me on my birthday without fail. And somewhere in between all of that, he had looked at an old man named Harold, losing everything, and thought I could do this better. "There's more," Margaret said, and her voice dropped a register. "Walter, during Eleanor's last week." Do you remember the afternoon of the 14th you'd stepped out to speak with her doctor? I remember. Derek was in the room with her for about 20 minutes while you were gone. She chose her next words with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them. I walked in to check her vitals. He was on his phone, not texting, talking. And I heard him say, and I remember this clearly, because it struck me as strange, "What's the current assessed value on the property?" She held my gaze. "He was asking about your house, Walter, while your wife was dying in the next room." The air went out of me like I'd taken a punch. My eyes stung that burning again, sharper this time, and I didn't entirely blink it back. 4 years I had been carrying Eleanor's last days like something sacred, and now one sentence had reached back into them and left a smudge I couldn't unsee. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice came out lower than I intended. "Because I thought I'd misunderstood," she said, and she sounded genuinely pained. "Because you'd just lost your wife. Because I was a nurse, not a detective." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the one that was trembling. "I'm telling you now." I turned my hand over and gripped hers. Not for comfort exactly, more the way you grip a railing when the ground shifts. "Margaret," I said, "when did you last check your other accounts?" She blinked, confused. "That's not I'm asking about your—" "Not you," I said. "Me." I let go of her hand and reached for my phone. "I only checked the one account. I have a savings account with a different institution. I haven't looked at it in—" I was already navigating to the second app. "A long time." The page loaded. The balance appeared. This one at least was untouched. But something Margaret had said was circling in my head, something about Derek asking about property values, about Garner, about all of it starting earlier than I had thought. I looked up from the phone. "I need a lawyer," I said. "Someone who handles financial fraud. Elder financial abuse." The term felt strange on my tongue. I was the elder. I was the one who'd been abused. "Do you know anyone in Pittsburgh?" Margaret's chin lifted slightly. The look of a woman who had spent a career navigating impossible situations and was not the least bit intimidated by another one. "As a matter of fact," she said, "I do." Michael Grant's office was on the 4th floor of a narrow building on Penn Avenue, the kind of office that belonged to a man who had been doing serious work for a long time and saw no reason to advertise it. No receptionist, no waiting room artwork, no potted plants. Just a desk, 2 chairs, floor-to-ceiling shelves, packed with case files and a window that looked out over the gray October rooftops of Pittsburgh. Michael himself was 60 years old and built like someone who had once been an athlete and then spent 2 decades sitting at that desk. He had the handshake of a man who meant it and the eyes of someone who had heard every version of every story and was still paying attention. "Margaret called me last night," he said, settling into his chair. "She gave me enough to get started, but I want to hear it from you." So I told him. All of it. The surgery, the power of attorney, the 8 transfers, the $85,000. I kept my voice level. Engineers don't editorialize. They report what happened and let the numbers speak. When I finished, Michael leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You said you signed a durable power of attorney naming Derek before the surgery. Do you have a copy? I can get one from the hospital." "Good. I'll need your bank statements going back 12 months and any emails or texts between you and Derek regarding finances." He picked up a pen. "Now, Walter, did Derek ever mention anything about a guardianship?" I felt my eyebrows pull together. "A guardianship, number. Why?" Michael turned his monitor toward me. On the screen was a legal filing case number date stamp, the probate court of Franklin County, Ohio. "Because 3 days before your surgery, Derek Hayes filed a petition for guardianship of your person and estate." The blood in my face went somewhere else entirely. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair. Say that again. A guardianship petition, Michael said, his voice careful and steady. In Ohio, a guardianship is a court-ordered arrangement where one person, the guardian, is granted legal authority to make decisions for another person. The ward, who the court determines, can no longer manage their own affairs. Unlike a power of attorney, which you grant voluntarily, a guardianship is imposed by a judge. Derek filed claiming you showed signs of cognitive decline and were at risk of making unsound financial decisions. I'd just been diagnosed with a hip that needed replacing, I said. My jaw was tight enough to ache. Not dementia. I know. Michael's tone didn't waver. The petition lists 3 things: your age, a note from a physician, not your surgeon, a different doctor I haven't identified yet, suggesting, quote, possible early memory impairment, and 2 incidents where Derek claims you mismanaged household expenses. He looked at me over the monitor. Were there any such incidents? No. That's what I expected. He printed the document and slid it across the desk. There's more. In the course of pulling this filing, I found property records. A licensed appraiser filed a property assessment on your home address in Columbus, dated 5 months before your surgery. The paper in my hands crinkled because my grip tightened without me telling it to. 5 months before. When I was still walking my neighborhood every morning, still taking on small consulting projects, still driving myself to the grocery store without a second thought. Derek hadn't waited for an opportunity. He had engineered one. He was building the case before there was a case, I said. Yes. Michael folded his hands on the desk. Walter, what you're describing, the financial transfers using the power of attorney, the guardianship petition built on fabricated evidence, the property appraisal ahead of time in Ohio. This constitutes elder financial abuse and fraud upon the court. Both carry serious legal consequences. I put the petition down on the desk. I needed my hands free. What do I do first? First, we get your power of attorney revoked immediately. I can file that today. Second, we file a counter motion against the guardianship petition and request an independent cognitive evaluation to demolish whatever that physician's note claims. He picked up his pen again. Third, and this is important, do not contact Derek. Do not warn him. Do not change your behavior in any way that signals you know what he's doing. Something shifted in my chest, not rage exactly. Something colder and more deliberate. The feeling I used to get when I found a flaw in a structural design, not panic, but the clear, methodical understanding that the problem must be addressed precisely, or it will bring down everything around it. There are other assets, I said. Things Derek doesn't know about. I need to make sure they stay protected. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. Tell me. Not yet. I stood up carefully, steadying myself on the chair arm. There's someone I need to call first. Can we meet again this afternoon? Michael looked at me, the look of a lawyer assessing whether a client is being strategic or foolish. Apparently, I passed. 3 o'clock, he said. Bring whoever you're calling. I was already reaching for my phone before I hit the hallway. Thomas Reed answered on the second ring, the way he always had. Some people treat a ringing phone like an inconvenience, and Thomas had never been one of them. Walt. His voice was exactly the same as it had been 3 years ago, the last time we'd spoken low. Unhurried, the voice of a man from eastern Ohio who had never seen the point of performing urgency he didn't feel. You sound like something happened. Something happened, I said. Can you come to Pittsburgh? A pause. Not hesitation. Thomas didn't hesitate. He was calculating drive time. I can be there by 2. He walked into Michael Grant's office at 1:52, looking exactly like himself, a big square-shouldered man of 55 in a canvas work jacket that had seen several Ohio winters' salt and pepper hair that hadn't been recently introduced to a comb, and the kind of handshake that made younger men remember their grip. He looked at me across the conference table, took in whatever he saw on my face, and said, "Hell, Walt, how bad is it?" "Sit down," I said. "I'll tell you." I walked him through it. The transfers. The guardianship petition. Michael's findings that morning. Thomas listened, the way he always listened on a job site, completely still, eyes forward processing. When I finished, he let out a long breath through his nose. "All right," he said. "The Millbrook account. You want to know if it's safe?" Michael leaned forward. "What is the Millbrook account?" Thomas looked at me. I nodded. 12 years ago," Thomas said. "Walter and I co-founded a limited liability company, Millbrook Construction Holdings, LLC. It holds a portfolio of passive investments we built up from profit sharing in several projects we consulted on after retirement. The LLC is registered in Pennsylvania. Neither of our personal names appears in the public filing. We used our initials and a registered agent." He opened the folder he'd brought and slid a document across to Michael. "Current balance as of last quarter, $340,000. Michael studied the document. "Derek Hayes has no record of this LLC." "No way he could," I said. "I never mentioned it. The account statements go to a P.O. box I've had since Eleanor was alive. Derek has never had access to that mailbox, and the LLC predates any power of attorney he ever held." "Good." Michael made a note. "This needs to be formally documented as outside the scope of any guardianship petition. I'll prepare a protective declaration." He looked up. "You said there were other assets." Thomas cleared his throat. "There's also the Eastbridge stake." He pulled out a second sheet. "In 2007, Walter took a minority equity position in a commercial redevelopment project in Columbus, the Eastbridge district. He put in capital early when the project was still risky and held through 2 recessions. Phase 2 completed last year. His share is currently valued at approximately $180,000, generating quarterly distributions." I watched Michael's expression shift, not dramatically, but enough. The shift of a man recalculating the size of what he was dealing with. "Derek filed his guardianship petition, believing your only significant asset was your home and the savings account," Michael said slowly. "Yes," I said. "He doesn't know about the LLC, the Eastbridge position, or the combined value of roughly $500,000 that sits completely outside his reach." "That's correct." Thomas looked at me. "How do you want to play this, Walt?" I pressed my fingers flat on the table. These were the same hands that had drafted the structural specifications for the Millbrook Bridge in 2003, the hands that had shaken Roy Decker's hand on the Eastbridge deal in 2007. 40 years of building things that were meant to hold weight. "We don't reveal it yet," I said. "Let Derek believe the picture is exactly what he thinks it is, a house, an empty savings account, a father who didn't see it coming." I looked at Michael. "How much time do we have before the guardianship petition reaches a hearing date?" "In Ohio, after filing, the court typically schedules a hearing within 30 to 60 days, Michael said. "Given the filing date, we're probably looking at a hearing in late November or December, unless we request an extension." "Then we have time." I sat back. "I want to go back to Columbus." Thomas's head came up. "Back to Derek's house?" "Yes." "Walt, I know what I'm doing, Thomas." I met his eyes across the table. "I spent 40 years reading blueprints that other people designed. I know how to walk through a structure and find every place where the load-bearing math doesn't add up." I glanced at Michael. "Derek built something he thinks is solid. I want to walk through every room of it before I bring it down. Thomas studied me for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the specific expression of a man who has worked alongside someone for decades and knows exactly what they look like when they've already decided. "You're going to need a better phone," he said. "Something with decent storage." "Already on my list." Michael set down his pen. "Before you go back, there's one more thing I found today. Thomas, you mentioned Roy Decker." He looked between us. "I pulled public property records this afternoon. Roy Decker filed a property interest declaration on Walter's home address in Columbus 6 weeks ago." He paused. "The same week Walter went into surgery." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Thomas went rigid. I felt something move behind my sternum, not pain, not quite. The specific ache of a betrayal you should have seen coming, but didn't because you were busy trusting people. Roy Decker, 20 years on the same job sites. The man I had defended in a contract dispute that cost me a project and never asked to be repaid for. "Who reached out to him?" I asked. "Derek or Roy?" "The filing was initiated through a brokerage account connected to Derek's company," Michael said. "But Roy signed it willingly." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table, jaw tight. "Walt Roy called me 3 weeks ago. Asked me some questions about your property, said he was doing due diligence on a potential purchase. I told him I didn't know anything about it. He looked at me directly, and something in his face that was not quite guilt, but was close to it. I should have called you right then." "You didn't know," I said. "I should have called anyway." He was right, but there was no point in going there now. I picked up the sheet with the Millbrook figures and folded it into my jacket pocket. "Set up the protective declaration for Millbrook and Eastbridge," I told Michael, "and get me everything you have on Roy Decker's filing." I stood up from the table, steadier than I'd felt since the pharmacy the night before. "I'm going back to Columbus, and this time I'm bringing better eyes." The motel room felt smaller after Thomas left. That's the thing about having company in a difficult situation. Their presence fills the space in a way you don't notice until they walk out the door and the walls move back in. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the Pittsburgh evening traffic 2 floors below and let the quiet do what quiet does. I'd skipped dinner. Wasn't hungry. What I had done was set my medication bag on the small desk by the window, and somewhere around 7 o'clock, for a reason I couldn't entirely name, I started looking at it. I am at my core a man of systems. 40 years of engineering teaches you that. Every variable has a label. Every component has a place. When I packed for Derek's house 6 weeks ago, I had sorted my post-surgery medications into 3 labeled bottles. I had written the labels myself in the black marker I kept in my desk drawer, the same handwriting I'd used on blueprints for 4 decades. Clear, precise. My letters don't slope. I picked up the smallest bottle, the one for what I'd been told was inflammation management. The label on it was in my handwriting, but the label was slightly crooked. I had never put a crooked label on anything in my life. I pulled it off carefully. Underneath, barely visible, was the ghost of an older label, the adhesive outline of something that had been removed and replaced. My hands went very still. I opened the bottle and shook one tablet into my palm. Round, pale yellow with a small embossed marking I didn't recognize. My post-surgical anti-inflammatory was a white oval. I had taken it enough times to know the shape by heart. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. She answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless, like she'd moved quickly to get to the phone. "Walter, what's wrong?" "I need you to listen carefully," I said, and I described the tablet color, shape, size, the embossed code on its face. My voice was steady, but my fingers were pressed flat against my knee to keep them that way. There was a pause on Margaret's end that lasted several seconds too long. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the precise, measured register I imagined she used when delivering news that couldn't be softened. Walter, that marking is a lorazepam identifier. It's a benzodiazepine, a sedative. Low dose, but it's used for anxiety management, and in older patients sometimes prescribed to manage agitation associated with cognitive decline. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, just the feeling of the floor rearranging itself beneath a set of assumptions I hadn't known I was standing on. "How long have you been taking it?" she asked. "Since the second week at Derek's house," I said. "I thought it was the inflammation medication. I thought the tiredness was recovery. The fogginess. I kept telling myself it was the surgery, the age, the—" I stopped, drew a breath. He swapped the label. "Walter." Margaret's voice was pained, pulling tight at the edges. "This is serious. What you're describing, replacing a prescribed medication without the patient's knowledge, that's a criminal act. And if Derek submitted a physician's note to the guardianship court claiming you showed signs of cognitive impairment during those weeks, he was creating the symptoms," I said, then documenting them. "Get those pills tested," she said, and now her voice had the hard forward edge of a woman who had spent 30 years in hospitals watching people get hurt by things that should have protected them. "A toxicology lab can confirm the compound. And Walter, you need a full cognitive evaluation from an independent neurologist. Not Derek's doctor. Someone you choose. The results will go directly against whatever that physician's note claims." "I'll tell Michael first thing tomorrow," I said. "Good." A pause. Then softer. "How are you feeling right now, physically?" That was a question with several honest answers. My hip ached the way it always did in the evenings. My head felt clearer than it had in weeks, which told me something I didn't want to think too hard about, because thinking about it meant acknowledging exactly how foggy the last month had actually been. "I'm angry," I said, "but my head is clear." "Good," she said again. "Hold on to that." I set the pill bottle on the desk beside my phone and looked at it. One small bottle with a crooked label. 42 years of fatherhood, and this was where it had arrived. A son who had looked at his father's medicine cabinet and seen an opportunity. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't have saved but recognized immediately: Derek's cell. "Dad, I know you're in Pittsburgh. We need to talk. Come home." Derek. My chest tightened, but not with fear. With something sharper and more clarifying. He was tracking me. Not through some sophisticated surveillance, more likely through the joint credit card I'd used to pay for the motel, the one account we still shared from when Eleanor was alive, and we'd set it up for emergencies. I hadn't thought to stop using it. That was a mistake I wouldn't repeat. I read the message twice. Come home. As if Columbus were still home. As if home were still something Derek had any authority to offer. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the notes application on my phone, the new phone I'd bought that afternoon in cash from a shop on Liberty Avenue, and I started writing. Dates, amounts, the pill bottle, the label, the text message. Every detail I could remember about the weeks at Derek's house, organized the way I organized everything chronologically, precisely, without editorializing. If Derek had built a case against me out of manufactured evidence, then I was going to build a case against him out of the real kind. I wrote until 11:30. Then I set the phone face down, turned off the light, and lay in the dark with my eyes open, listening to Pittsburgh settle into night around me. You've been here before, I told myself. Not Pittsburgh, the feeling. The moment on a job site when you realize the foundation has been laid wrong, and everything built on top of it is compromised. The choice is never whether to fix it. The choice is only how. I knew how. Michael Grant was already at his desk when I arrived at 8:15, a thick manila folder open in front of him, and a coffee going cold at his elbow, the way coffee goes cold when you've been reading for 2 hours and forgot it was there. He looked up when I came in, and something in his face told me the folder was not good news. Michael Grant was the kind of man whose expression gave almost nothing away, which made the slight tightening around his eyes that morning feel like a shout. "Sit down, Walter," he said. I sat. He turned the folder toward me and spread the contents across the desk: printed records, court filings, UCC lien registrations, what looked like a partial credit report. "I've been pulling public records since 6 this morning," he said. "Business filings, court judgments, secured debt registrations, all public record in Ohio. What I found took me about an hour to compile and about another hour to fully believe." I leaned forward. "Tell me." "Derek's company, Hayes Property Consulting, LLC, registered in Franklin County, in 2019 operated legitimately for approximately 2 years. Modest revenue, nothing remarkable." Michael pointed to a column of figures on the top sheet. "Then beginning in early 2022, the borrowing started. First, a business line of credit for $80,000 with First Federal. Then a commercial loan for $120,000 with a regional lender out of Cincinnati. Then a private note, meaning a loan from an individual investor, not a bank, for $60,000, with terms that suggest desperation rather than negotiation." I studied the numbers. My stomach was turning slow and cold. "What's the total as of last month?" Michael pulled the summary sheet to the top. $412,000 across 3 institutional lenders, 2 private notes, and 1 deferred payment agreement with a contractor who apparently stopped waiting. He looked at me over the papers. "Walter, his company has no significant assets, no active revenue-generating contracts in the past 14 months, and 3 outstanding judgments from creditors who've already sued." I pressed my back against the chair. $412,000. I had built a 40-year career making sure I never owed anyone more than I could pay back on a bad month. And my son had accumulated nearly $500,000 in debt and apparently decided the solution was his father's house. "There's something else," Michael said. He pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the pile. "In his application for the most recent private loan submitted 8 months ago, Derek listed your military pension and projected Social Security benefits as collateral assets supporting his creditworthiness. He listed them as, quote, accessible family income." The air went out of my chest. My hands balled into fists on my knees, not from anger, from the effort of keeping very, very still. He used my income as if it were his. He represented your financial future as part of his asset base, Michael said, his voice flat and precise. "Without your knowledge or consent. That constitutes loan fraud under federal statute." Margaret, sitting in the chair beside mine, made a sound low in her throat. Not quite a word, just the sound of someone absorbing a blow they'd been half expecting. She'd come with me that morning, and I was glad of it. Having another person in the room when the worst of it lands makes the room feel less like it's closing in. "There's a pattern here," Michael continued, pulling out 2 more documents. "In 2022, the same year the heavy borrowing started, Derek was named in a civil complaint filed by a man named Harold Garner, whose father lost $60,000 through an informal financial management arrangement. The complaint was settled out of court." He tapped the page. "Derek paid $4,500 and signed an agreement with no admission of liability. Harold Garner's father never got his money back." My throat ached. I had heard Harold's story from Margaret 2 nights ago, but hearing it framed in legal language, complaint settlement, no admission of liability, made it concrete in a different way. Made it a rehearsal. Made my $85,000 not a moment of desperation, but a continuation of a practice. "He didn't make a mistake," I said. He ran a method. That's my assessment, yes. Michael folded his hands. Walter, I want to talk about what we do with this. We have enough to file a counter motions against the guardianship petition today with your cognitive assessment results as supporting evidence. We can also file a police report for the medication tampering and a separate complaint for the financial transfers under Ohio's elder abuse statutes. I looked at the pile of documents. $412,000. A method. A rehearsal. If we file the counter motion today, I said, Derek knows I'm fighting back. Yes, and he'll accelerate. He'll try to push the guardianship hearing forward, move the property sale faster, possibly try to get you to sign something before the court can intervene. Thomas, standing near the window where he'd been listening without speaking, turned around. So you let him think he's still in control. For now, I said. Michael studied me. Walter, going back to Derek's house knowing what you know, that requires a level of composure that most people in your situation wouldn't. Michael. I looked at him steadily. I designed load-bearing structures for 4 decades. I know what it means to hold weight without showing the strain. I picked up the summary sheet and set it back on the pile, squaring the edges the way I squared everything. Don't file anything yet. I need 2 weeks inside that house. Then we file everything at once. The room held the decision for a moment. Then Michael reached across the desk and shook my hand. Not the handshake of a lawyer closing a deal, but the handshake of one person telling another, I trust your judgment. 2 weeks, he said. Then we move. Before I tell you what I decided to do next, something that most people in my position would never consider, I want to know if you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That's all. Just a 9. It tells me you're here, and honestly, knowing you're listening makes it easier to keep going. One thing worth mentioning, parts of this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. If that's not something you're comfortable with, this is a perfectly good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. I left Pittsburgh on a Monday morning at the end of October, when the trees along I-70 had gone fully amber, and the sky was the kind of pale blue that only shows up in Ohio for about 2 weeks a year before winter closes it down for good. I drove the rental car myself. 4 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I had enough to think about without it. The neighborhood looked exactly the same when I pulled onto Derrick Street. The same neat lawns, same minivans in driveways, same American flags that suburban Columbus puts up and forgets to take down. I parked at the curb, sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and gave myself the only piece of advice I had left to give: do not show them what you know. Not yet. Not one word of it. Then I got out of the car, walked to the front door, and rang the bell. Derek answered in 12 seconds. I counted. He was in a collared shirt, already dressed for a day that hadn't started yet, and the expression on his face moved through a sequence so fast I nearly missed it. Surprise, then a flicker of something calculating, then the warmth he switched on like a lamp when he'd decided how to play a room. Dad. He pushed the door open wide. You came back. I did, I said. Come in, come in. He stepped aside, gesturing like a man welcoming a guest he'd been expecting, which I now understood was exactly what I was to him. A necessary guest, an asset that had wandered off and returned on its own. We were worried about you. Rachel's been asking about you. He said it smoothly enough that someone who didn't know better might have believed it. I walked past him into the front hallway and set my bag down. Rachel appeared at the end of the hallway, coffee mug in both hands, watching me with an expression that wasn't warmth and wasn't hostility. It was the careful measuring look of someone trying to read a situation that had shifted without her being told how. She was sharper than Derek gave her credit for. I had always suspected that. Walter, she said, You look better. Pittsburgh agreed with me, I said. Derek closed the door behind me and clapped his hands together the way he did when he wanted to signal that a problem had resolved itself. Well, the important thing is you're back. Your family dad. This is where you should be. The word family in his mouth landed like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples spread and kept my face as smooth as the surface above them. I thought so too, I said. I'd like to stay a while longer, if that's still all right. Of course it is. He said it too fast and too bright. The specific brightness of a man whose plan had just been handed back to him. We've kept your room exactly the same. I nodded and picked up my bag. As I started toward the stairs, a sound from the upper landing stopped me, footsteps quick and light. Owen appeared at the top of the staircase in his school clothes backpack half zipped, staring down at me with an expression that cracked something open behind my ribs. The boy's face was doing three things at once: surprise, relief, and a wariness that had no business living in a 14-year-old's eyes. He'd gotten it from watching the adults around him, and I hated that he'd had to. Grandpa. His voice cracked on the second syllable. You're back. I'm back, I said. I looked up at him steadily. Come down here a second. He came down 3 steps and stopped just within reach. I put my hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, the way my own father had done for me, when words weren't the right tool. Owen straightened slightly under it, like something that had been leaning found a wall to rest against. You doing all right? I asked him quietly. Yeah, he said. Then after a half second, better now. I gave his shoulder one more press and let go. Good. Go catch your bus. He went, casting one look back at the foot of the stairs, not at Derek, not at Rachel. At me. I watched him go and felt the full weight of why I was here pressed down through my chest and into my feet like a structural load finding its anchor. That evening I sat in the guest room with the lights low and a book open in my lap that I wasn't reading. Derek moved through the house with the ease of a man whose world had righted itself. I heard him on the phone twice, both times in the kitchen, voice pleasant, the words indistinct. I made note of the times. I made note of everything. It was past 11 when the house quieted. I was lying in the dark, not asleep, when Derek's voice started up again from the bedroom at the end of the hall. Lower this time. The concentrated low of a man who thinks everyone else is unconscious. I couldn't make out every word. But I'm a man who spent 40 years put on construction sites where communication had to cut through noise, and I knew how to hold very still and let sound carry to me. He's back. Yes, I know it changes things. The meeting still needs to happen before December. If I can get him to sign before the hearing date, we don't even need the court order. My eyes were open in the dark, fixed on the ceiling. The hearing. He already had a date. And he needed my signature on something which meant the guardianship petition alone wasn't enough for what he was planning. He needed my voluntary consent for the property sale, and he was counting on getting it before the court could weigh in. Sign before the hearing date. I reached over to the nightstand and opened the notebook I'd brought from Pittsburgh. In the dark, writing by feel, I put down, overheard 11:14 p.m., references meeting before December, needs signature before hearing date, 2 separate tracks, petition and sale. Then I closed the notebook, set it back in the drawer, and lay with my hands flat on the blanket. Derek thought I had come back because I had nowhere else to go. That was fine. Let him think it. The man who underestimates a foundation always gets surprised by how much it can bear. A week passed the way weeks do when you're watching carefully, slower than normal every hour, weighted with small details that most people would miss. I watched Derek leave the house at 7:40 each morning, always on his phone before he reached the car. I watched Rachel move through the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through motions they'd stopped feeling. I watched Owen eat breakfast alone most mornings, while his parents existed in separate corners of the same room, and I sat at the table with him and talked about whatever he wanted to talk about his history class. A book he was reading the right way to identify load-bearing walls in an old house which he found inexplicably interesting. I was building a map of the house's rhythms. Engineers do that before they do anything else. The package from Thomas arrived on a Tuesday. He'd ordered the devices before I left Pittsburgh, and I'd arranged a mailbox at a shipping store 3 blocks away under my own name the week before to receive it. I picked it up on my morning walk, the walks I'd started taking each day, slow and steady, which Derek seemed to interpret as an old man being harmless. 3 small devices, each the size of a matchbox, each designed to look like a commercial smart home temperature sensor. Thomas had included a handwritten note. Wireless. Motion activated. 30-day battery. Footage uploads to the private account I set up. Check the email I sent your new phone. Below that, in Thomas's square engineer's handwriting. Don't put them anywhere stupid. Walt. I didn't. That afternoon, I asked Owen if he'd help me with something after school. His face lit up with the particular enthusiasm of a teenager who is bored and curious in equal measure. What kind of something? Technical, I said. I want to put up some smart home sensors, temperature, motion. I'm used to having them at home and the house feels different without them. Owen looked at me with those sharp young eyes that saw more than they let on. Okay, he said simply. He didn't ask why. He was good at not asking why when he sensed the answer was complicated. We put one in the front hallway, positioned above the coat rack, where it looked like it had always been there. One in the corner of the living room, tucked behind a decorative speaker Derek had bought and never used. One in the upstairs hallway, mounted beside the thermostat, where a sensor was entirely unremarkable. Derek came home while we were finishing the last one. He looked at the device on the wall and then at me on the step stool, and something passed across his face, not suspicion exactly, more the reflex of a man who had been managing risks for so long that everything slightly new registered as a variable. Getting comfortable, Dad? He asked. Just like being useful, I said. I stepped down from the stool and handed Owen the screwdriver. Your son's a good apprentice. Derek looked at Owen with the distracted half-smile of a man who registers his child's presence the way he registers furniture, aware of it, not particularly engaged by it. That's great, he said, and went upstairs. Owen watched his father go. Then he looked at me, and I saw something move behind his eyes. Something older than 14, the particular gravity of a kid who has been paying attention to the wrong things for too long. I put my hand briefly on top of his head, the way I used to when he was small. Go start your homework, I said. I'll make dinner. That night, I lay in bed watching the footage on my phone, silent, small-screened, but clear enough. Derek in the living room at 9:15, pacing phone pressed to his ear. I turned the volume up. The audio wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The guardianship hearing is December 12th. I need the property appraisal filed with the court before that. Tell Roy the purchase agreement needs to be ready to go if the judge approves the petition. I want to move within 48 hours. December 12th. The room number. The time, the sequence of events. It was all laid out in his voice like a blueprint he didn't know anyone else was reading. My hands were steady on the phone, but my chest was burning. Not grief this time. Something harder. The particular heat of a man who has been patient for a very long time and can feel the end of the patience within reach. I saved the file. I sent a copy to the secure account Thomas had set up. Then I typed a message to Michael, December 12th. That's the hearing date. Roy Decker has a purchase agreement ready. Derek plans to move within 48 hours of approval. Michael replied at 11:03, confirmed. I'll move the counter-motion filing to week of December 1st, unless you say otherwise. We'll be ready. I set the phone down on the nightstand. Through the wall, I could hear the house settling, the click of the heating system, the distant sound of Owen's television, the muffled footsteps of Derek moving between rooms like a man rehearsing something. Then someone knocked softly on my door. Rachel. She stood in the doorway in a cardigan and bare feet, holding nothing, which meant she hadn't come for a reason she could explain, with an object in her hand. She came because she needed to say something and had finally run out of reasons not to. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yes," I said. I sat up against the headboard and waited. She came in and sat in the chair by the window, pulling her knees up slightly, making herself smaller in the way people do when they're about to say something that makes them feel exposed. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at me. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the night on the stairs. What I said." "Sit down, Rachel." I kept my voice even. "I'm not interested in the apology. Tell me what you actually came to say." She blinked. Then something in her shoulders dropped, the posture of a woman who had prepared for a different conversation and found herself relieved not to have it. "I know what Derek is doing," she said. "I've known for months, and I haven't stopped him." My jaw tightened, but I held my voice level. "Why? Because I was afraid." Her voice cracked on the last word, not dramatically, just the small fracture of someone being honest about something shameful. "If Derek loses everything, we lose everything. Owen loses his school, his life. I told myself staying quiet was protecting my son." She pressed her lips together. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like fear," I said. "Fear isn't evil, but it has consequences." She nodded, eyes going bright with tears she didn't shed. "What are you going to do, Walter? What needs to be done?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Then, can I help?" I studied her face, the tiredness in it, the something underneath the tiredness that looked like the first edge of a decision. "Derek has files in his office," I said. "Physical files in the lower desk drawer. Can you get me access?" She stood without a word, went down the hall, and came back 2 minutes later with a manila folder thick enough to matter. She set it on the bed in front of me. "I've known about these for 2 months," she said quietly. "I just didn't know what to do with them." I opened the folder. On top was a draft purchase agreement. Walter J. Hayes, property buyer, listed as Roy Decker, price $224,000. Market value was closer to $285,000. Below that, in Derek's handwriting, "Get signature at family meeting, December 12th. They weren't going to ask me. They were going to hand me a pen in a room full of people and count on me not making a scene. Rachel watched me read. Her face had gone pale and still. "Walter," she said, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "There's something else. Something I found on his phone last week." She held out her phone to me. On the screen was a text exchange between Derek and someone named Dr. Simmons, a psychiatrist. The last message read, "Confirmed for December 12th, on-site assessment. If results show any impairment, we proceed directly to emergency guardianship motion. A backup plan. If I wouldn't sign willingly, he'd have me declared incompetent in front of the family and let the court do it for him." I set the phone down on the bed and looked at the wall across the room. Everything Derek had built pointed at December 12th. Every document, every arrangement, every quiet phone call in the night. He had chosen the date. He had set the stage. He just hadn't considered that someone else might already know every line of the script. The chair had been wobbling for 3 weeks before I finally did something about it. It was the old Adirondack on the back porch, white paint gone gray at the edges, one rear leg slightly shorter than the other, after years of Ohio winters working at the joint. Derek had mentioned fixing it twice and done nothing about it, which surprised no one. I found a small toolbox in the garage, brought it out to the porch, and got to work. Owen appeared at the back door 20 minutes later, still in his school clothes tie, loosened backpack dropped somewhere inside. He looked at me crouched over the chair with a hand level and a wood screw and came out without being asked. "Can I help?" he said. "Hand me the 3/4-inch screw," I said. "The one on the left." He found it, handed it over, and crouched beside me. I showed him how to read the wood grain. Before you drill, go against it, and you split what you're trying to fix. He listened the way he always listened to things that involved his hands completely, without fidgeting. We worked for a while without needing to fill the air. Then Owen said, without looking up from the joint he was holding steady, "Dad's been on the phone a lot at night." "Has he?" I said. Not a question. A door I was leaving open. I can hear him from my room. Owen's jaw tightened, slightly too young to know how to hide that, yet which was one of the things I was grateful for. He gets loud when he thinks everyone's asleep. Last week he said. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," I said. "No, He exhaled hard through his nose the way his grandmother used to when she was frustrated and trying to be fair about it. He said once we get the old man's signature, everything gets fixed. And Mom didn't say anything back. She just went quiet. He finally looked at me and his eyes were burning with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite hurt, but lived somewhere uncomfortable between the two. "He was talking about you, wasn't he?" I set the screwdriver down on the porch railing and looked at my grandson. He deserved a real answer, not a managed one. "Yes," I said. "He was." Owen's shoulders dropped like something heavy had been confirmed rather than denied. "I found something in his office last week," he said. "I wasn't snooping. I went in to get the stapler for a school project. But there was this paper on top of his desk. It had your name on it." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. I took it. I don't know if that was wrong. I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a printed agenda, Hayes family meeting, December 12th, with a list of attendees, a sequence of agenda items, and at the bottom underlined twice, presentation of independent assessment results. Motion for immediate guardianship transfer. My throat went dry. They had given it a name. A family meeting, like it was a holiday dinner. "You did the right thing," I told Owen. I refolded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket. "Owen, what you heard, what you found, I need you to keep it between us. Can you do that?" He straightened his spine and looked at me steadily. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." We finished the chair. I tested its solid level the way it should have been for years. Owen sat in it and rocked back experimentally, then grinned, the first real, unguarded grin I'd seen from him since I came back. "Good as new," he said. "Better," I told him. "New things haven't been tested yet." He laughed at that short and genuine, and for just a moment he was simply 14 again and not carrying anything heavier than a school backpack. The moment was interrupted by a voice from the other side of the fence. "Walter Hayes. Is that you?" Carol Hensley was 63 years old, 5'2", and had the kind of direct gaze that came from decades of watching a neighborhood and minding it properly. She was standing at the fence line with gardening gloves in one hand and an expression that said she had been waiting for an opportunity like this one. "Carol," I said, genuinely glad to see her. She and her husband Frank had lived next door for 19 years. Frank had been a construction foreman, a good one, before he passed 4 years ago. Carol had inherited his eye for details that didn't add up. "I've been meaning to call you," she said, moving to the gate. "Can I come through for a minute?" Owen read the room and stood up. "I'm going to start my homework. he announced with the diplomatic instinct of a boy who had learned when adults needed to talk privately. He went inside, sliding the door shut behind him. Carol came through the gate and lowered her voice even though there was no one to hear. "Walter, while you were in the hospital, and in the weeks after, there were people here, at the house." "What kind of people?" "Twice that I saw." She pulled out her phone, an older model with a cracked screen she'd never gotten around to replacing. "The first time I thought it was a repair crew. They had measuring equipment. But Frank always said you can tell the difference between a man who's measuring to fix something and a man who's measuring to value something. These men were valuing." She turned the phone to show me a photograph, two men in the driveway, one holding a laser measuring device pointed at the front of the house. "I took this because something felt wrong. I'm glad I did." My heart knocked hard against my ribs. "When was this?" "First one end of August. You'd just gone in for surgery." She swiped to a second photo, a different man, different day, closer to the house, photographing the foundation. "Second time, 3 weeks later." "Carol." My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "Would you be willing to put what you saw in a written statement, signed, notarized?" She didn't hesitate for even a second. "I'll do it tomorrow morning," she said. "And Walter, I'm not the only one. Jim Paulson across the street saw the same thing. So did the Brewers at number 41. She met my eyes with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had spent 2 decades watching out for this street. We all saw it. We just didn't know what we were seeing until now. I pressed my hand over hers on the fence post. My eyes stung just briefly, just a flash. Not from sadness. From the particular piercing relief of discovering you are not as alone as you thought you were. That evening, I sat at the desk in the guest room and updated the file on my laptop. Carol's photographs. Owen's paper. The names Jim Paulson, the Brewers. I typed methodically the way I had typed engineering reports for 40 years, every fact in its place, every date confirmed. Then my phone buzzed. Michael Grant Roy Decker filed updated property interest declaration today. He's added a co-buyer. Someone named Larkin, no prior connection to you or Derek that I can find. Walter Derek is accelerating. He may be trying to move the sale before the hearing, not after. We need to talk." I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed back, "Call me tomorrow at 8. I have more for you." Outside the window, the November dark had settled over the suburb like a held breath. Somewhere in this house, Derek was sleeping soundly, certain that December 12th was his. He had no idea how many people were awake. Derek left for his Tuesday morning meeting at 6:58. I heard the garage door, the engine, the specific sound of a man who believes his house runs on his schedule, even when he's not in it. I was already dressed. I had been up since 5:30, which was not unusual for a man my age, and I had spent the early morning reviewing the file on my laptop and adding Carol's photographs, which she had texted to me the night before, with the efficiency of a woman who did not do things halfway. By the time I came downstairs, Rachel was standing at the kitchen counter with a mug in both hands and the look of someone who had made a decision while the coffee was brewing and was about to act on it before she could talk herself out of it. "He won't be back until noon," she said by way of greeting. "I know," I said. She set her mug down, pulled out the chair across from mine, and sat. Her hair was pulled back, and she wasn't wearing the careful, composed expression she usually wore in this house, the one I had come to think of as her armor. This morning she looked tired in the honest way, the way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying something too long. "I need to tell you the rest," she said. I poured myself coffee and sat down. "Then tell me." 4 months ago, Derek sat me down and explained the plan. Her voice was flat and precise, like she was testifying rather than confessing, which I respected. He called it a financial restructuring. He said your assets were sitting idle, that you'd understand if you knew the full picture, that it was temporary. He made it sound. She stopped, pressed 2 fingers to her mouth briefly, then lowered her hand. He made it sound like something a reasonable person could go along with. But you knew it wasn't, I said. I knew. Her eyes went bright and hard. I knew the minute he mentioned the guardianship that it wasn't restructuring. You restructure finances with someone's knowledge and consent. You file for guardianship when you want to take the choice away from them entirely. She exhaled sharply. But I was scared, Walter. Our mortgage is Derek's business income. Owen's school is Derek's business income. If I blew this up... Her voice cracked just slightly, and she pressed her lips together until it steadied. I told myself I was protecting Owen. I know that's not good enough. No, I said gently. It isn't, but it's honest. She nodded, blinking hard. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and laid something on the table between us, a folded document, heavier than a single sheet. I printed this from his email 3 days ago. He doesn't know. His laptop auto-logs in when it opens, and he left it on the kitchen table last week while he was in the shower. She pushed it toward me. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, what needs to be done. I unfolded it. It was an email chain, Derek to Dr. Simmons, dated 2 weeks prior, 4 messages deep. The final message from Derek read, confirmed for December 12th on site. Bring the standard cognitive battery. If results show any impairment at all, even borderline, I need you to document it as clinically significant. We won't get another chance at this. Below it, Dr. Simmons's reply. Understood. I'll need the family meeting schedule at least 48 hours in advance. My hands tightened on the paper until my knuckles ached. Derek hadn't just hired a psychiatrist. He had asked him to skew the results. That crossed from aggressive legal strategy into outright fraud on the court. Walter, Rachel's voice was very careful. I want to help. Whatever you're doing, and I can see that you're doing something, I want to be part of it. I looked at her across the table. I thought about the night on the stairs, about the word exhausting, about all the months she had known and said nothing. And then I thought about what it costs a person to sit across from their father-in-law and say I was wrong, I was afraid, I want to fix it. That is not a small thing. It is in its way the hardest thing. If you help me, I said, it means testifying against your husband. It means your marriage, your finances, all of it. It becomes part of a legal proceeding. Are you prepared for that? Her jaw tightened. Her eyes didn't waver. He signed my name on a loan application 6 weeks ago, she said, her voice dropping to something low and shaking with controlled fury. Without asking me, without telling me. I found out when the lender called to confirm my quote-unquote verbal approval. She leaned forward slightly, both hands flat on the table. He's not just hurting you, Walter. He's been lying to me for 2 years. I am done being the person who stays quiet in this house. The anger in her face was clean and real, and had clearly been building for longer than she'd admitted to either of us. All right, I said. Then here's what I need. I walked her through it. Michael Grant, the counter-motion filing the plan for December 12th. I told her about the camera footage without going into detail about where the cameras were. I told her about Carol Hensley and the neighbors. I watched her absorb each piece with the focused, slightly pale attention of someone assembling a picture they had previously only seen the edges of. When I finished, she looked down at the email printout still on the table between us. He asked the psychiatrist to document impairment even if there isn't any, she said. That's perjury. That's fraud. Yes, I said. She looked up at me. Call your lawyer, she said. Tell him he has a witness. I reached across the table and picked up my phone. Outside the kitchen window, The November morning was gray and still over the suburb. In 4 weeks, Derek was planning to sit his father down in front of a room full of people and hand him a pen, counting on the weight of the crowd and the presence of a paid psychiatrist to do the rest. He had planned for a great many things. He had not planned for his wife. Michael Grant had been driving from Pittsburgh to Columbus every Wednesday for 3 weeks, which told me something about the kind of lawyer he was. The kind who believes proximity to a case matters, that you cannot fully understand what someone is fighting for until you've stood in the same zip code as what they stand to lose. He'd rented a small working space in a shared office building on High Street 10 minutes from Derek's neighborhood. We met there at 10 in the morning in a room that smelled of other people's coffee and had a window that looked out over a parking structure. It was not a beautiful office. It was a functional one which suited both of us fine. Thomas was on speakerphone from Cleveland. I could hear the faint sound of his office in the background, a space heater, the occasional creak of his chair, the same sounds that had been the background of 100 working lunches across 30 years. "I'll start with the good news," Michael said, setting a folder on the table. "The independent neurological evaluation came back this morning." He turned the top sheet toward me. "Dr. Patricia Holt, board-certified neurologist, University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center. She administered the full cognitive battery memory processing speed, executive function, verbal fluency. 45 minutes. Your scores. Walter are in the 83rd percentile for a man your age." He allowed himself a brief dry satisfaction. "Whatever that physician's note in Derek's petition claims, we have a board-certified specialist from a major research hospital who will say the opposite under oath." I let out a breath I'd been carrying for longer than I realized. My shoulders dropped a full inch. "Good," I said. "What's the bad news?" "Not bad news, exactly. More of a complication." Michael pulled a second sheet. "In pulling Derek's full history for the counter motion, I found something I need to ask you about directly." He set the page in front of me. In 2010, Derek was named in a civil complaint in Franklin County. Breach of contract and fraudulent misrepresentation in a real estate transaction. The complaint was filed by a woman named Gloria Pittman. She alleged Derek had misrepresented the conditions of a commercial property. He brokered and pocketed proceeds that should have been disclosed. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not surprise, but the particular ache of something confirmed that you'd hoped wouldn't be. "The case never went to hearing," Michael continued. "It was settled out of court 14 months after filing. The settlement included a payment to Ms. Pittman and a non-disclosure agreement." He looked at me steadily. "Walter, the settlement amount was $42,000, and the payment came from a personal account in your name." Thomas's voice came through the speaker, quiet and careful. "Walt." "I know," I said. Michael kept his voice even. "You paid $42,000 to settle a fraud complaint against your son, without Derek ever appearing in court, without a public record of a judgment against him." "He called me from a parking lot," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended, rougher at the edges. "Crying. He was 27 years old, and he said he'd made a mistake, and he didn't know what to do, and he was terrified. I drove to Columbus that same night." I stopped, pressed my hands flat on the table. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a young man learning an expensive lesson. I paid the settlement. I covered the attorney fees. I called in a favor with someone I knew at the licensing board to keep Derek's broker's license intact. I looked at the page in front of me. I never told anyone. I never asked Derek to repay it. I thought if I handled it quietly, he would understand what it cost me, and he would do better. The room held that for a moment. Through the window, the parking structure sat gray and ordinary in the November light. "Did he know you did all of that?" Michael asked. "Yes," I said. He thanked me. He cried again. He said he'd never put me in that position again. The burn behind my eyes was sharp and sudden, and I blinked against it hard. He was sitting at my kitchen table when he said it. Eleanor made him dinner. She didn't know why he was really there. My throat tightened until the next words had to push through it. She thought he'd just come to visit. Thomas made a sound on the speakerphone that wasn't a word. He didn't need to say anything. 30 years of working alongside someone builds a language that doesn't require sentences. Michael, I steadied my voice. Does this help or hurt us? It helps, Michael said firmly. It establishes a pattern. Derek has used deceptive financial practices before and faced no meaningful consequences because you protected him. It also demonstrates that he has knowledge of what real fraud looks like and chose to repeat it. He paused. It may be painful to have on record, but it's the truth, and the truth is what we're building this case on. I nodded. Then use it. Thomas's voice came through again. There's something else, Walt, about Roy Decker. He cleared his throat, the sound of a man preparing to say something he doesn't enjoy. I made some calls this week. Reached out to people who still move in those circles. Roy didn't get pulled into this. He walked in. A pause. He reached out to Derek's company 18 months ago, offered to serve as a straw buyer for distressed properties situations where a seller needed to move fast and quietly, and the transaction needed to look arm's length. He's done it twice before with other clients of Derek's. The name Roy Decker had always carried a particular weight for me. 20 years on the same sites, the dispute I'd put myself in the middle of to defend him, the professional capital I'd spent to make sure he came out of it with his reputation clean. And he had walked into this willingly. He had called Thomas about my house because Derek asked him to, and he had done it because there was money in it, and because neither of them had believed I would find out. My jaw ached from holding it still. He knew it was my house, I said. Yes, Thomas said. He knew. All right. I picked up the pen on the table in front of me. My hand was steady. I was a long way past shaking. Michael, file the counter motion. File it today. Michael looked at me with the measured expression of a man who had asked this question before and knew the weight of it. Once I file, Derek will know by end of day. He'll accelerate everything. The property sale, the hearing, he'll try to move faster than we can respond. Let him, I said. We're ready. Michael reached across the table and we shook hands, the handshake of two men who had just committed to something that would not be comfortable or quick, but would be right. I'll have it filed by 2 o'clock, Michael said. I was already reaching for my coat. I was back at the house by 4 in the afternoon. Derek's car was in the driveway earlier than usual. He never came home before 6 on Wednesdays. The moment I saw it, I understood Michael had been efficient. The counter motion had been served, and Derek had spent the intervening hours driving home to confront whatever was waiting for him there. He was standing in the front hallway when I came through the door. Not pacing, not shouting, just standing, which was in some ways worse. Derek, at his most dangerous, had always been Derek, very still. He was holding a document in his right hand, and even from the doorway, I could see it was the counter motion, filing the pages slightly bent from being gripped too hard. You want to tell me what this is? His voice was low and controlled the way a fire is controlled when the room it's in hasn't caught yet. I set my coat on the hook by the door and turned to face him. You know what it is. I know what it says. He held it up, the pages shaking slightly, betraying the control the rest of him was working to project. It says you filed a counter motion against my guardianship petition. It says you have a neurologist's report, financial records, bank documentation. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. You've been building a case in my house while you were living under my roof. Yes, I said. Something moved across his face, a crack in the controlled surface, and beneath it something raw that I recognized. Not guilt. Shock. The shock of a man who had so completely not accounted for this possibility that his mind was still working to accept it as real. "How long?" he asked. His voice dropped. "How long have you known?" I walked past him into the living room. He followed. Rachel was already there, standing near the far wall with her arms at her sides, not crossed, not defensive, just present, watching. I sat down. Derek stayed standing, which was fine. Let him have the height. It didn't change the geometry of what was happening. "How long have I known what, Derek?" I said. "About the guardianship petition you filed 2 weeks before my surgery, about the appraiser you sent to my house 5 months before that, about the $85,000 you transferred while I was unconscious after a surgery, about the medication you swapped out, so I would seem confused enough to justify the petition you'd already written." Each question landed in the room like a nail, driven clean. "Which part do you want to know when I found out about?" Derek's face had gone from controlled to pale. His hand dropped to his side, the document hanging loose. "The medication, how did you—" "A nurse who was sharper than you counted on," I said. He pulled in a breath that was almost a sound, almost the beginning of something that might have been real if he'd let it out. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and said, "I was trying to protect you, Dad. You're 72. You live alone. After the surgery, I could see you weren't—" "Don't." My voice came out harder than I intended, and I didn't soften it. "Don't offer me that version of this. I have the petition date. I have the appraiser's invoice. I have your phone records showing you contacted Roy Decker 9 months before my surgery." I looked at my son, this 42-year-old man standing in his own living room looking like the ground had been pulled out from under him, and I felt something in my chest that hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my hip. "You planned this before I was sick. You didn't see an opportunity. You created one." Derek's eyes went to Rachel. Whatever he saw in her face made something in his expression collapse inward. "Rachel, don't," she said. One word, quiet and final the way a door closing is quiet and final. He turned back to me, and now the control was genuinely gone. His face was stripped down to something younger and more frightened than the 42-year-old businessman had any right to look. "Everything I did was for this family," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that told me he half believed it. "For Owen's future. For the house, the business I was drowning, Dad. I was drowning and I didn't know how to ask you for help." The crack in his voice reached something in me that I hadn't expected, something that hurt in a different way than the anger did, because I heard the truth in it. Not a justification, a confession. The specific anguish of a man who had made catastrophically wrong choices and had now run out of road. "Derek," I leaned forward, "asking me for help was always available to you. Walking into my house and telling me you were in trouble would have cost you nothing but pride." I held his eyes. "What you chose instead was to look at your father and see a problem to be solved." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. From the hallway, a sound, the soft creak of the third stair from the bottom, the one Owen always landed on, coming down. I looked toward the doorway. Owen stood there in his school clothes backpack, still on, having apparently just come in, and walked into the middle of something he hadn't expected. He looked at his father. Derek looked back at his son. And Owen, 14 years old, and already carrying far too much of what the adults around him had failed to manage, said, in a voice that was steady, in the way that only genuine conviction makes a voice steady, "Dad, do you want me to treat you the way you treated Grandpa when you get old?" The room went absolutely airless. Derek stared at his son. His eyes went wet, sudden, and unguarded. the tears of a man who had been holding everything in place for so long that one honest question from a child was enough to undo it entirely. His chin trembled. He pressed his lips together hard. He couldn't answer. He didn't have an answer. And I think in that moment, every person in the room understood that the absence of an answer was the most devastating thing of all. Derek walked out of the living room. His footsteps went up the stairs. The bedroom door closed, not slammed, which surprised me. Just closed. The sound of a man with nowhere left to go. Rachel let out a long, shaking breath. She looked at Owen with an expression so full of complicated love and pain that I had to look away from it. Owen walked into the room and sat down on the couch beside me. He didn't say anything else. He just sat there close enough that his shoulder was almost touching mine, staring at the carpet. After a long moment, he said quietly, "Was that the right thing to say?" I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had when he was small and frightened and needed to know someone was there. "Yes," I said, "it was exactly the right thing." The morning after Derek walked out of his own living room, the house felt like a building that had been through a significant structural event, everything still standing, but something fundamental had shifted in the load-bearing walls. Derek left early before anyone else was up. I heard his car at 6:15. Rachel made breakfast without speaking more than a few words, which I respected. Owen ate his cereal and asked me if I wanted to walk with him to the bus stop, which I did even though the December air had teeth in it, and my hip reminded me of every step on the way back. 2 days later, I went to see Carol Hensley. She had the notarized statements ready, her own Jim Paulson's from across the street, and the Brewers from number 41 stacked in a manila envelope on her kitchen table like she'd been expecting me to come for them since the day she'd first shown me the photographs. Knowing Carol, she probably had been. "Coffee first," she said, in a tone that was not a question. "Coffee first." I agreed. We sat at her kitchen table, the same yellow-topped table she'd had since Frank was alive, the kind that outlasts fashions and arguments and a great deal else. She wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at me with the frank, steady gaze of a woman who had lived next door to my family's situation for weeks and had made peace with what she was about to do. "Jim's statement covers the first visit," she said. "He was out walking his dog early that morning and saw the car parked in your driveway. He wrote down the license plate out of habit. Frank always said, 'Write down license plates, you never know.'" She pushed the envelope toward me. "The Brewers saw the second visit. Sandra Brewer photographed the company logo on the appraiser's clipboard. She couldn't read the name at the distance, but it's clear enough that a record search will identify the firm." My chest warmed with something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this simple, uncomplicated gratitude. These were people who had watched out for a neighbor they hadn't been asked to watch out for, who had paid attention when they could have easily looked the other way. "Carol," I said, my voice coming out rougher than intended, "why did you save all this, the photos, the plate numbers? You didn't know at the time that any of it would matter." She looked at me steadily over her mug. "Because it felt wrong, Walter. And Frank always said when something feels wrong, write it down. The truth has a way of needing witnesses." My eyes stung. I blinked it back. "Frank was a smart man. He was an annoying man," she said, with the fond precision of someone who has had decades to distinguish between the two. "But yes, also smart." That afternoon, I sat across from Michael in his borrowed Columbus office and laid the envelope on the table. He opened it, read through each statement methodically, and by the time he reached the third one, something in his expression had shifted into the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a structure come together the way it was designed to. "This is everything I needed," he said. "There's more." I slid my phone across the table, with the camera footage queued up, Derek's late-night call, Roy Decker's name, the 48-hour window. Michael watched it twice, made notes, and sat back. Walter, I need to ask you something, and I want you to take time with the answer. He set down his pen. With what we have, the financial transfers, the medication tampering, the fraudulent physician note, the court fraud through Dr. Simmons, we are well past the civil case. Elder financial abuse at this level in Ohio is a felony. Derek could face criminal prosecution, potentially years. He met my eyes directly. Do you want to pursue that? The questions sat in the room between us. I thought about Owen at the breakfast table. I thought about Rachel's voice saying I was afraid. I thought about Derek at 27 crying in a parking lot, and the version of him that had once existed before the debt and the desperation had finished their work on him. No, I said. I won't be going to the police. The civil case, the financial restitution, the guardianship petition dismissed. That's what I want. Michael nodded slowly. That's your right. The civil remedies are substantial. He picked up his pen again. I've also prepared a motion for a temporary restraining order. It will prohibit Derek from initiating any financial transaction involving your assets while the case is active. The judge can sign it before December 12th. Then get it signed, I said. He already had the papers ready. Of course he did. Rachel called Michael herself that evening. I was in the next room and heard her voice measured clear, with a steadiness that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. I want to be on record as a witness, she said. Whatever that requires, I'll do it. When I heard that something released in my chest that had been wound tight for longer than I could account for. Not victory. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a load being properly distributed, at last the weight going where it could be held. The 11th of December arrived the way significant days often do, ordinary on the surface. Heavy underneath, the kind of morning where the coffee tastes the same, and the news plays the same, and the world goes about its business as if nothing particular is about to happen. I spent the day reviewing the file one last time. Not because I needed to, I had read every document so many times that the page numbers were memorialized, but because going through the work had always been how I prepared for something important. 40 years of pre-construction walkthroughs had wired me that way. By 9 o'clock, the house had gone quiet. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about tomorrow, specifically just letting the stillness settle around me. Owen knocked at 9:10. He came in carrying a mug of warm milk, the old-fashioned kind, heated on the stove, a faint skin forming on top the way Eleanor had always made it, on nights when I came home from difficult jobs. He set it on the nightstand with the careful precision of a 14-year-old trying very hard to do something exactly right. "Grandma used to make this for you," he said. "Mom told me once." My throat closed so fast it almost hurt. I reached over and picked up the mug with both hands just to have something to hold. "She did," I said, "every time I came home late from a bad sight." Owen sat on the edge of the chair by the window elbows, on his knees, hands clasped. "Are you scared about tomorrow?" he asked. "No," I said. "Are you?" He thought about it with the genuine seriousness that I had come to understand was simply how Owen engaged with questions that mattered. "A little," he admitted. "Not about what happens to us, about what happens to Dad." My chest ached in a way that was becoming familiar, the specific pain of loving someone while being unable to save them from themselves. "That depends on your father," I said. "Not on me, not on you. That has always been true." Owen nodded, absorbing that. Then he said goodnight and went to his room. I sat with the warm milk for a long time after he left. It was past 11 when the knock came, 3 quiet raps, not Owen's knock. I said, "Come in." Derek stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He was in a t-shirt and sweatpants, no phone in his hand for the first time in what felt like months. He looked smaller without the phone. He looked closer to the person he used to be. He sat in the chair Owen had just vacated and leaned forward, forearms on his thighs, hands hanging loose. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the floor, the way he had as a teenager after doing something he couldn't explain away. "I'm not here to ask you to call it off," he said. "I know it's too late for that, and I know I don't have any ground to stand on." "No," I said. "You don't." He nodded at the floor. He stopped. His jaw tightened and released. "I need you to know that I know what you did in 2010. I've always known, and I never—" His voice fractured at the edges. "I never said thank you. Not the way I should have." The burn was immediate and sharp behind my eyes. I pressed my lips together and breathed through it. "I didn't do it to be thanked," I said. "I know." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were wet and raw and completely unguarded in the way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "That's what makes it worse, Dad. You did it because you loved me. And I looked at that, I looked at what you did for me, and I decided it meant I could keep coming back for more." His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment to hold it steady. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I'm saying it anyway." I looked at my son, this man who had broken something significant between us, and was sitting in my borrowed chair at 11 o'clock, the night before his own reckoning, saying the only true thing he had said to me in longer than I could measure. "I know you are," I said quietly. He straightened, wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist, quick and almost embarrassed. "The Millbrook account," he said. "My lawyer found the LLC name. He doesn't know what's in it, but he found it." He looked at me steadily. "How long have you been protecting that?" 12 years, I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I considered the question, the real version of it, not the surface version. "Because some things you keep for yourself," I said. "Not out of distrust, out of wisdom. When you've worked for something long enough, you understand the difference between sharing and surrendering." Derek absorbed that. He nodded once slowly. Then he stood, and at the door he stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking back, just standing there in the threshold, the way people do when they have one more thing and aren't certain whether to say it. "I used to want to be like you," he said. "When I was young, before I decided that wanting something was the same as deserving it." He paused. "I forgot the difference somewhere." He went out. The door closed softly. I turned off the light and lay back on the pillow. The house settled around me, the heat clicking on somewhere down the hall, the quiet that meant everyone was where they needed to be. December 12th was 8 hours away. Every document was filed. Every witness was ready. Every piece of the structure I had spent 3 months building was in place, load-tested and sound. For the first time since a September night on a dark staircase, I closed my eyes and slept. I was in my chair in the corner of the living room at 9:30 when the first guests arrived. Derek had arranged the room the night before, chairs in a loose semicircle, a small projector set up on the coffee table, the kind of staging that was meant to look informal but had clearly been planned. He moved through the preparations with the focused energy of a man who had convinced himself that controlling the environment was the same as controlling the outcome. By 10 o'clock, the room held 8 people besides our family, Carol Hensley, who had taken a seat near the window and was watching everything with the patient attention of a woman who had been building to this moment since August. Roy Decker, sitting near the door, with his shoulders pulled in slightly, the body language of a man who had already started calculating his exit. Dr. Simmons, a slight man in his 50s with a leather portfolio on his lap. Three relatives of Derek's I hadn't seen in years, and Michael Grant, whom Derek had not invited, and whose presence, when Derek clocked it, made the color drain from his face so fast it was almost audible. "What is he doing here?" Derek said, low and sharp. "I invited him," I said pleasantly. "He's my lawyer. He goes where I go." Derek's jaw worked. He looked at Michael, then back at me, and something behind his eyes recalculated its speed. But the room was full of people, and Derek had spent too many years performing composure to break it now. He straightened his collar and turned to address the group. He started smoothly, concerned. Son, aging father, family responsibility. He had clearly practiced this. He spoke about my surgery, my recovery, the challenges of living alone at 72, the importance of proper financial oversight for aging parents. He made it sound like love. He was good enough at it that two of the relatives were nodding. Then he introduced Dr. Simmons as an independent consultant and asked if I would answer a few questions. I said certainly. Dr. Simmons opened his portfolio and began standard cognitive battery, the kind used in clinical settings. Date, day of the week, current president, count backward from 100 by sevens. Name 3 objects, recall them 5 minutes later. Draw a clock face set to 10 past 11. I answered each question without pausing, clearly completely without a single hesitation. By the 4th question, Dr. Simmons had stopped writing and was simply looking at me. By the 7th, he closed the portfolio. Derek was watching the doctor's face with the expression of a man watching a structural beam begin to bow the wrong direction. "Dr. Simmons," he said with a tightness in his voice that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago, "perhaps a few more." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Simmons said, and he looked at Derek with an expression that contained something very close to regret. "I have what I need." What he had was a result that would not support the petition, and every person in the room who had been paying attention understood that. I stood up. "I'd like to say something," I said. Derek turned to me. "Dad." "Derek." My voice was calm and full, the voice I used to use on job sites when something important needed to be heard over the noise. "Sit down." He sat. I looked around the room at Carol, whose hands were folded in her lap, at Roy, who had gone very still, at the relatives who were now watching me instead of Derek. 3 months ago," I said, "I left this house at 4:45 in the morning with a suitcase and a note that said I didn't want to be a burden. What I didn't know then was that my son had been planning for my absence long before that morning." I spoke steadily without heat. "He filed a petition to take legal control of my life 2 weeks before my surgery. He transferred $85,000 from my savings account while I was unconscious in a recovery room. He replaced my post-surgical medication with a sedative to manufacture the symptoms of cognitive decline. He then submitted to a court as evidence." The room had gone absolutely still. Derek's hands on his knees were gripping hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. Michael stood and introduced himself. He laid the counter motion on the coffee table, the neurologist's report. Beside it, the bank records beside that. He explained each document in the clear, unhurried way of a man who has prepared so thoroughly that the facts do all the dramatic work for him. Roy Decker's face had gone from pale to the particular gray of a man watching a building he helped design begin to fall. He stood up before Michael finished. "Derek," he said, his voice tight with the fury of someone who had been misled about the terms of what he was participating in. "You told me Walter had agreed to the sale. You told me this was his decision." Derek opened his mouth. "Don't!" Roy picked up his jacket. "I'm not going down for this." He walked out. The front door closed behind him with a finality that made two of the relatives flinch. Then Rachel stood. She was shaking slightly. I could see it in her hands, the fine tremor of someone doing something terrifying and doing it anyway. "I need to say something," she said. Her voice cracked on the first word and held steady after that. "I knew about this plan for 4 months. I stayed quiet because I was afraid. That was wrong, and I'm not staying quiet anymore." She looked at the remaining guests directly without flinching. "Derek signed my name on a loan application without my consent. I have the documentation. I am a witness in this case." Derek's shoulders collapsed inward. He looked at his wife with an expression so fractured I had to look somewhere else. Owen stood up from the back of the room. He was the youngest person there by 30 years, and he stood with his spine straight and his chin level and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. "Dad." He waited until Derek looked at him. "I asked you this once already. I'm still waiting for an answer. What kind of son do you want me to be?" No one breathed. Derek stared at his son, and his eyes went wet and devastated, and he pressed his lips together so hard they went white, and he could not answer. Not in front of these people. Not out loud. Because there was no answer that wouldn't condemn him. The doorbell rang. Michael went to the door. The process server stepped in, located Derek by the description he'd been given, and handed him an envelope. Derek took it automatically, the reflex of a man whose hands still worked even when his mind had stopped. He read it. Temporary restraining order. Civil restitution filing. Dismissal motion against the guardianship petition. Court date in January. He looked up. His face was the face of a man who had built something elaborate and watched it dismantle in 40 minutes. "Derek." I walked to where he stood. I kept my voice low enough that only he could hear. "I'm not filing criminal charges. I want you to understand that. What happens next is civil. You'll repay what you took. You'll answer to the court. But I am not trying to put you in prison." I looked at my son directly. That decision cost me something. I made it for Owen. Try to be worth it. He couldn't speak. He nodded once small, the nod of a man who has nothing left to perform. I stepped back. The room slowly, quietly began to empty. I drove back to my own house on the 21st of December, 9 days after the family meeting, when the temporary court orders had been filed and the immediate legal fire had been brought to something manageable. My house, the one I had bought in 1991 and rebuilt across 2 summers with my own hands and Thomas's on the weekends. The driveway still had the slight crack along the left edge that I had always meant to fill and never quite gotten around to. I pulled in and sat in the car for a moment, just looking at it. Eleanor had planted the rosebush by the front steps in 1994. It was dormant now, bare thorned stalks in the December cold, but it would come back in May the way it always did. It always had. I got out, unlocked the front door, and went inside. Thomas arrived an hour later with a bottle of scotch he'd been saving for an occasion he was willing to describe only as significant enough to justify it. He set it on the kitchen table, found 2 glasses, without being told where they were, and poured without ceremony. "How's the hip?" he asked. "Better than it was," I said. "Better than September." He raised his glass. I raised mine. We drank without a toast, which was exactly right. "The LLC is secure," Thomas said. "Michael filed the protective declaration. Millbrook and Eastbridge are fully documented as outside the civil estate. Derek's lawyer can't touch them." He swirled the scotch once. "What are you going to do with it all, Walt?" I had been thinking about that for 3 weeks. The answer had come to me the way answers usually come, not as a decision exactly, but as a recognition of something that had always been true. "I'm meeting with Michael next week to revise the will," I said. "Owen gets a trust funds held until he's 25, managed independently. His education, his start. That doesn't change. I set my glass down. The rest, Millbrook Eastbridge, the house after I'm gone, it goes into a foundation. Walter and Eleanor Hayes Foundation. Free legal assistance for elderly people facing financial abuse by family members. Thomas looked at me for a long moment. His eyes did something complicated that he covered by looking down at his glass. Eleanor would have liked that, he said. I know, I said. It was her money that started Millbrook in the first place. Seemed right. He nodded. We drank again. Owen came on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas, without his parents, the first time he'd made the drive on his own, borrowing Rachel's car, with the careful pride of a teenager newly licensed. He came in, looked around the house he'd visited a dozen times as a small boy and said, I forgot how much bigger this feels than Dad's place. Your grandmother chose it, I said. She had good instincts. We sat at the kitchen table, and I showed him the old project drawings, the Millbrook Bridge plans from 2003, the Eastbridge commercial specs from 2007. He studied them with the same focused attention he'd given the wobbly chair on the back porch, asking real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than politeness. Could I learn this? He asked, pointing to a load distribution diagram. And if you want to, I said. It takes time, but you have good hands and you pay attention. That's most of it. He grinned wide and unguarded, the grin of a boy who has been told something true about himself. My chest filled up with something warm and uncomplicated, the feeling of a man who has come through something difficult and arrived somewhere worth being. Rachel called that evening. Her voice was steadier than it had been in months. She and Derek were separating. She had found an apartment. Owen would split his time, the practical machinery of the end of a marriage grinding forward. I don't regret helping you, she said. I want you to know that, whatever it costs. I know, I said. Thank you, Rachel. A week after Christmas, I was sitting on the front porch with my coffee when a car turned onto my street and slowed at the curb. Derek's car. He sat inside for a long time, engine running, not moving, not getting out, just sitting. I watched him through the steam rising from my cup. I didn't wave. I didn't stand. After 5 minutes, the car pulled away and disappeared around the corner. I didn't know what he was carrying in there. I didn't know if it was guilt or grief or the beginning of something better. That was no longer mine to carry for him. I had done that for 42 years, and it had not helped either of us. What I knew was this: I was sitting on the porch of my own house in the cold December air, with a cup of coffee I had made myself, watching the street I had lived on for 30 years. The rosebush was dormant by the steps. The crack in the driveway was still there. Everything that mattered was still standing. I lifted my cup and drank, and let the morning be exactly what it was. People ask me sometimes, was it worth it? All of it. The motels, the lawyers, the months of holding every card close to my chest while the man I raised slept down the hall. My answer is always the same. It wasn't about being worth it. It was about being right. I'm 72 years old. I've built bridges, raised a son, buried a wife, and learned more about human nature in 3 months than I did in 40 years on a job site. And if I'm being honest with you, truly honest, I have to say this. I waited too long. I forgave too easily. I confused love with permission, and I let that confusion cost me more than money. Don't be like me. Don't wait until your account is empty and your medication has been swapped out before you ask the hard questions about the people you trust. Family justice doesn't come from staying quiet. It comes from standing up calmly with documentation before the damage is done. There's a verse I've carried since Eleanor passed. God does not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. A sound mind. That's what they tried to take from me. That's what I fought to keep. What I've learned is this revenge dad is not a father who destroys his son. A real revenge dad is one who refuses to be erased, who chooses family justice not through anger, but through patience and truth. Because real family justice, the kind that lasts, is built the same way a good structure is built. Slowly, carefully, on ground that holds. That's my story, and I believe somewhere in it there's a piece of yours too. If this reached something in you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to stay for the next one, you know what to do. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than I can say. A quick note. The stories on this channel are inspired by real experiences, but contain fictional elements constructed with one purpose: to make you think. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best. But if you're still here, I'm glad you are.